Parking in front of a school for a business meeting, a millionaire noticed a 6-year-old girl crying alone by the gate. Moved by an inexplicable compassion, he approached and asked what was wrong. With a trembling, fearful voice, she whispered, "Uncle, I'm afraid to go back home." He thought it was just childish imagination, but when she mentioned what her stepfather did to her, his world collapsed. Arthur Sterling watched the world through the tinted glass of his German sedan, a silent, impenetrable cocoon that insulated him from the colorful chaos of everyday life. The afternoon sun bathed the street in a golden, merciless light, highlighting the peeling paint and graffiti-covered walls of the public school in front of him. For a man whose universe was composed of climate-controlled boardrooms, ascending stock tickers, and the discreet clinking of silverware in exclusive restaurants, this scene was almost an affront. He was here, begrudgingly, for a meeting about a mentorship program his public relations team insisted was crucial for the company's image. A waste of time, in his opinion, time that could be better spent analyzing the profitability of new investments or diversifying his already vast portfolio. His life was a fortress built on the cold logic of numbers and absolute control. Every minute of his day was scheduled, every interaction calculated. Emotions were liabilities, weaknesses that compromised the soul's cash flow. That was why, when his eyes caught a small anomaly in the orderly landscape he forced himself to see, an initial wave of irritation washed over him. Leaning against the iron gate long after the final bell should have dispersed the crowd of children was a tiny, solitary figure, a girl, perhaps 6 or 7, in a worn but impeccably clean uniform, clutching a faded pink backpack. She wasn't simply waiting. Her body trembled with silent, devastating sobs that shook her small shoulders. Arthur tried to ignore it. It wasn't his problem. It was a deviation from the plan, an unwanted variable in his perfectly balanced equation. He glanced at his wristwatch, a Swiss masterpiece whose value could feed a family for a decade. He was late. The school principal was waiting. Still, something pinned him there. The child's solitude was so absolute, her despair so palpable, that it pierced the armor of indifference he wore like a second skin. With a sigh of frustration, he killed the engine. The simple act felt like a capitulation, a breach in his own iron discipline. He stepped out of the car, and the afternoon heat hit him, the smell of hot asphalt and dust mixed with the sweet scent of blossoms from a nearby crepe myrtle. His Italian leather shoes, polished to a mirror shine, seemed absurdly out of place on the cracked sidewalk. He approached slowly, as one would a startled animal. The girl lifted her head as she sensed his shadow, and her eyes, large and brown, were red and swollen, filled with a fear that went far beyond a simple playground scuffle or a bad grade. It was an ancient, profound fear that didn't belong on a face so young. He crouched down, an awkward and uncomfortable movement for both his knees and his ego. Meeting her at eye level felt like a dangerous concession. "Are you okay, little one?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended, unaccustomed to soft tones. The girl sniffled, her knuckles white as she gripped the backpack strap. For a moment, he thought she would run. Instead, she took a hesitant step toward him, as if the presence of a stranger was somehow less frightening than what awaited her. She glanced at the luxury car, at his expensive clothes, and then back to his face. A torrent of emotions passed through her eyes, hesitation, desperation, and finally, a spark of desperate trust. "Mister," she whispered, her voice choked with tears, a fragile sound nearly lost in the traffic noise. "I'm scared to go home." The words hung in the hot air between them. Arthur felt a strange contraction in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation he couldn't name. Scared to go home. For a child, home was supposed to be the safest place in the world. He frowned, his business mind trying to categorize the problem. "Are your parents angry with you? Did you do something wrong at school?" She shook her head vehemently, the tears starting to fall again, silent and hot down her dirty cheeks. She moved a little closer until he could feel the slight tremor of her body, leaning toward his ear as if the school walls could hear. She confessed her terrifying secret in a whisper that made Arthur's safe, controlled world stop spinning. "The mean man who lives with us hurts my mum," she said, her voice broken. "And he said he'll do the same to me if I tell anyone." The girl's whisper, her name was Leah, he would soon learn, echoed in Arthur's mind with the force of an explosion. "The mean man who lives with us hurts my mum." The simple, direct sentence demolished the orderly structure of his world in seconds. He, a man who had built a fortune predicting market movements and controlling every variable of his business, felt completely paralyzed. His vast assets, the gold in his vaults and the crypto in his digital wallets, seemed useless against the pure terror on that child's face. For an instant, the street noise vanished, and all that existed was the child's pleading gaze and the crushing weight of her confession. He looked at her hands, tiny and smudged with chalk dust, clinging to her backpack strap as if it were the only safe thing in her universe. His first reaction was denial. Children have vivid imaginations. Maybe it was an exaggeration, a cry for attention, but there was no fantasy in the purple bruises he now noticed, faint but present, on her wrist. Peeking from beneath her uniform sleeve, there was no invention in the way she flinched at every loud sound from the street. The coldness that had always served him so well began to melt, replaced by a hot, uncomfortable sensation spreading through his chest. It was anger, a cold, precise anger, directed not just at this mean man, but at a world that allowed such a thing to happen. "Who is this man, Leah?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain calm and steady, a tone he used to soothe panicked investors during a market crash. "It's Ricardo," she replied, her voice trembling. "He lives with us now. Mommy said he was going to help us because she lost her job." The stepfather. The piece clicked into place, forming an ugly, familiar picture, financial vulnerability being exploited. Arthur's stomach turned, his mind, trained to find solutions, went into crisis mode. The standard procedure was clear: notify the proper authorities, the school, the police, child protective services. He didn't have to get personally involved. He could make a call, delegate the responsibility, and return to his life of profits and dividends. "All right, Leah, listen," he said, trying to regain control. "We're going to go back inside the school and talk to your principal. She'll know what to do." He stood up and held out his hand to her, expecting the offer of an adult, logical solution to calm her. Instead, panic seized her face. She recoiled sharply, shaking her head with a desperate violence that startled him. "No, please, no," she begged, the tears returning with full force. "I already told the principal. This morning, I told her Ricardo yelled at Mommy again." Sobs stopped her for a moment. "She didn't believe me. She said I shouldn't make up stories about adults and that my mom would be very sad with me. She sent me away." The revelation hit Arthur like a bucket of ice water. The system, the safety net he assumed existed to protect children like Leah, had not only failed but had punished her for asking for help. The principal had dismissed her. The anger inside him intensified, now mixed with a sense of helplessness. There was no one to delegate to. The responsibility, unwanted and heavy, had landed squarely in his lap. He looked at the closed school gate, now a symbol not of education, but of indifference. And he looked at Leah, a victim abandoned by those who should have protected her. He was trapped. Leaving her here was unthinkable. Taking her back home would be delivering her to the monster she feared. There was only one logical, albeit complicated, path left. "Okay, calm down," he said, crouching again. "We won't talk to the principal. What's your mother's phone number? I'll call her and we'll sort this out." He hoped his name, Arthur Sterling, a name that opened doors and sealed multi-million-dollar deals, would be enough to intimidate any abuser. But Leah's reaction was even more terrifying than before. Her eyes widened, and a genuine dread took hold of her. "No, mister, please don't call," she whispered, grabbing his suit jacket sleeve with force. "He warned me. Ricardo said if I talked to any strangers, he would make my kitty disappear, and he told me to never, ever talk to men like you, who have big cars and look like they have a lot of money." Leah's statement, so specific and premeditated, hit Arthur with surgical precision. Men like you, who have big cars and look like they have a lot of money. This wasn't the random threat of a common abuser. It was a strategy. This man, Ricardo, wasn't just an impulsive monster. He was calculating. He had foreseen scenarios, identified potential threats, and planted targeted fear in the heart of the most vulnerable person in the house. Arthur's mind, accustomed to analyzing business strategies and anticipating competitors' moves, began to race. He wasn't dealing with a simple domestic problem. He was facing an adversary who thought, planned, and manipulated with terrifying clarity. For the first time in years, Arthur felt the ground beneath his feet was unstable. He looked around, the sunny street suddenly seeming full of shadows. Every passing car, every person on the sidewalk could be an observer. He felt exposed, vulnerable. His entire fortune, built on ruthless decisions and an aversion to personal risk, offered no script for this situation. What good was a diversified stock portfolio or access to exclusive hedge funds if he couldn't guarantee the safety of a terrified child in front of him? The capital he'd amassed seemed like a sick joke. He was a completely powerless multimillionaire. All conventional doors were closed. The school had betrayed her. Her mother was under duress, a prisoner in her own home. Calling the police without concrete proof would be the word of a wealthy stranger against a stepfather who would undoubtedly present a facade of normalcy and concern. They might even accuse him of meddling. Ricardo could turn the tables, paint Leah as a fantasy-prone child and the mother as a victim of Arthur's intrusion. The situation could escalate for Leah in ways he didn't dare to imagine. He needed time, information, and above all, a safe place for the girl while he decided on the next move. The decision formed in his mind, not as a logical choice, but as the only option left in a minefield. It was a decision that went against all his instincts for self-preservation and detachment. "Leah," he said, his voice softer now, devoid of its usual authority. "I believe you, every word." He saw a flicker of relief in her eyes, so fleeting he almost missed it. "We're not going to call anyone right now. And I promise I won't take you home. We're going to a safe place where I work. It's a very tall building full of people and no one can hurt you there. You can stay in my office, draw, watch cartoons on my big screen, whatever you want, just until we figure out the best way to help your mom, okay?" He saw the internal battle on her face, the taut mistrust versus the desperate instinct to seek help. She looked into his eyes, searching for something, any sign of deceit. Arthur held her gaze, trying to project a sincerity he barely recognized in himself. Slowly, as if the movement required all her courage, she nodded. A weight he didn't know he was carrying seemed to lighten slightly. He stood up, and this time, when he held out his hand, she took it. Her small hand was warm and fragile in his, and the physical contact, something he usually avoided, seemed to anchor him in the moment. He led her to the car, opened the rear passenger door, and helped her in, fastening her seatbelt with clumsy gentleness. As he closed the door and walked around to the driver's seat, he felt the monumental weight of what he was doing. He was, for all intents and purposes, taking a child he didn't know without her guardian's permission. One wrong move, one misinterpretation, and his entire life, his business, his carefully constructed reputation, could come crashing down. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her, huddled on the vast leather seat, looking even smaller and more vulnerable. As he started the engine, Leaving the school and his predictable life behind, an overwhelming thought hit him, cold as ice. My God, what have I done? The sterling Capitol skyscraper was a tower of glass and steel that pierced the sky, a monument to Arthur's ambition and success. It was his kingdom, an environment where every polished corridor, every piece of minimalist art, and every efficient employee reflected his vision of order and control. As he entered the lavish lobby with Leah in tow, Arthur felt dozens of curious stares. The presence of a child in a public school uniform with a faded pink backpack was an anomaly as glaring as a glitch in the stock market. His executive assistant, Helena, an impeccable middle-aged woman who had been with him for nearly a decade and knew his idiosyncrasies better than anyone, raised a perfectly arched eyebrow but maintained her unflappable professionalism. Mr. Sterling, the principal of the school called, concerned about your delay, she said, her voice a model of discretion. Cancel it, Helena. Something more urgent has come up, he replied, his voice firm, allowing no questions. He led Leah through the lobby, his hand protectively on her shoulder, feeling the small tremors still running through her body. Inside his top-floor office, with glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the city, the vastness of the world outside seemed to contrast with Leah's small, terrified figure. It was a sanctuary of power, decorated with designer furniture and cutting-edge technology. The silence was broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system and the distant clicking of keyboards on the floor below. Leah stood near the door, awestruck and intimidated, her wide eyes taking in every detail. Arthur realized he needed to transform this intimidating space into a refuge. He loosened his tie, a gesture he normally only made at the end of an exhausting day. Make yourself comfortable. Leah, you can sit here on the sofa. Would you like some juice? Hot chocolate? Helena can get you whatever you want. She shook her head, still too scared to speak. He turned on the enormous screen on the wall, which usually displayed stock quotes and treasury bond yields, and searched for cartoon channels. The sound of laughter and children's music filled the austere silence, a surreal dissonance. He asked Helena to bring juice, cookies, and a pad of paper with colored pencils, trying to create a bubble of normalcy for the girl, while Leah hesitantly settled onto the Italian leather sofa and began to draw. Arthur sat at his mahogany desk. His mind, however, was miles away from the profit and loss spreadsheets on his monitor. He watched Leah, the way she concentrated on her drawing, her tongue between her teeth, and felt a lump in his throat. With every laugh from the TV, she would startle, looking toward the door as if expecting the monster from her nightmares to appear at any moment. It was during one of these tense silences between one cartoon and the next that she finally spoke again, her voice low, almost a whisper. He doesn't let Mommy talk to anyone, she said suddenly, staring at a fixed point on the Persian rug. Not even Grandma. He says her family doesn't like him and they just want Mommy's money. Arthur swiveled his chair to face her, giving her his full attention. What money, Leah? The little bit of money Daddy left for us when he went to live in heaven. Mommy kept it in a small box, but Ricardo said it was better if he took care of it, to make it grow. He said it was a good investment. The words grow and investment, used so innocently, sounded like an alarm in Arthur's head. The pattern was becoming terrifyingly clear. Isolation, financial control, intimidation. Ricardo wasn't just being abusive. He was executing a methodical plan to take total control of this woman's life, using financial security as bait. Leah continued, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if a dam had broken. He yells at her when the phone rings. He broke her old cell phone and gave her a new one, said it was so she wouldn't be bothered. And at night I hear Mommy crying in her room, really quiet. He locks the door. He says it's for privacy, but I think it's so no one can hear. Every detail was a piece of a horrifying puzzle. The control of communication, the isolation from a support network, the psychological violence veiled under the pretext of care. Arthur's blood ran cold. He was facing a sophisticated predator, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate his victims and the system. His decision to bring Leah to his office hadn't just been a detour. It had been the opening move in a dangerous game he didn't know how to play. And looking at the girl, who was now drawing a dark house with a large, menacing figure at the door, he realized he was in too deep to back out. His only option was to see it through, whatever the cost. The urgency of the situation weighed on Arthur like a toxic asset on his balance sheet. Every minute that passed with Leah in his office was a calculated risk that became increasingly difficult to justify. He had to act, but with the precision of a surgeon, as one wrong move could cause irreparable harm. His first instinct, that of a man accustomed to solving problems with financial resources, was to contact Leah's mother, Monica, directly. He believed that perhaps an adult-to-adult conversation, away from Ricardo's influence, could break the cycle of fear. Using Leah's last name, which he gently asked for, and a quick search on his systems, he found the phone number Ricardo had given her. He moved to a corner of the office, trying to keep the conversation private, though Leah's watchful eyes followed him across the room. He took a deep breath and dialed. The phone rang only twice before a hesitant, weary female voice answered. "Hello, Mrs. Monica. My name is Arthur Sterling. Before he could continue, a man's voice boomed in the background, loud and authoritarian. "Who is that, Monica? Didn't I tell you not to answer unknown numbers?" There was a muffled sound, as if a hand had been placed over the receiver. Arthur heard a hurried, frightened whisper from the woman. Then, her voice returned to the line, but completely different. It was forced, almost robotic, as if she were reading a script. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but my daughter is at school and will be home soon. I appreciate your concern, but we are fine. Please do not call again." "Mrs. Monica," Arthur insisted, his voice low and firm. "Your daughter Leah is with me. She is safe, but she is terrified to come home. She told me some things." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, freighted with a palpable panic. For a second, Arthur thought the connection had dropped. Then he heard a stifled sob, quickly choked back. Monica's voice returned, now with a desperate urgency that contradicted her words. "Give me back my daughter immediately. What are you doing with her? This is kidnapping. I'm calling the police. Ricardo, he's calling the police," she shouted, clearly for the man beside her to hear. And then, in a whisper so low, Arthur almost missed it, she added 3 words that confirmed all his fears. "Don't trust him." The line went dead. Arthur stood frozen, phone in hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. The message was twofold and crystal clear. Publicly, Monica was a puppet in Ricardo's hands, forced to play the part of a concerned mother whose child had been taken by a stranger. Privately, in that stolen whisper, she was a prisoner sending a distress signal. The manipulation was deeper than he had imagined. Ricardo wasn't just controlling her actions, he was controlling the narrative. He looked at Leah, who watched him with eyes full of a sad, precocious understanding. She knew what had happened. She knew her mother couldn't save her. Arthur's frustration hardened into a cold resolve. The direct path was blocked. He would need a different, more subtle approach. His net worth and his network of contacts, which had seemed useless moments before, now became his primary weapons. He picked up his other phone, a secure line he used for confidential business, and dialed a number from his contacts. "Marcus, it's Arthur. I need a favor, a big one, and a discreet one. I want you to run a background check on a man named Ricardo, last name to be confirmed. He's living with a woman named Monica and her daughter, Leah. I need to know everything. Past, jobs, previous relationships, any record, no matter how small. And I need it yesterday. Marcus was the best private investigator money could buy, an ex-cop who navigated the city's shadows with quiet efficiency. If there was anything to find on Ricardo, Marcus would find it. As he ended the call, Arthur felt a new kind of weight. He had crossed a line. He was no longer just a good Samaritan helping a child in distress. He had gone to war with an invisible and manipulative enemy, and the stakes in this game weren't a business deal or an investment. They were the life of a little girl who, in just a few hours, had found a place in a corner of his heart he never knew existed. He looked out the window at the city sprawling beneath him, a chessboard where he had always been the king. Now he felt like a pawn moving into unknown and dangerous territory, and checkmate felt perilously close. The days that followed transformed Arthur's sterile routine into a constant exercise in improvisation and secrecy. Leah became a small shadow in his empire of glass and steel. Helena, with her unquestionable loyalty and supernatural efficiency, organized a routine for the girl. One of the lesser-used conference rooms was quietly converted into a makeshift children's space, complete with a small television, art supplies, and even a few toys Helena purchased herself, charging them to the company's miscellaneous expense account without a single question. To the rest of the world, to the analysts and portfolio managers who circulated through the floors, Leah was Arthur's niece, visiting for a few days. A fragile lie that Arthur knew wouldn't hold up for long. While Leah found a fragile sense of safety within the office walls, Arthur's world outside was beginning to unravel. The initial report from Marcus, the investigator, arrived in a sealed envelope, hand-delivered. The information was disturbing. Ricardo, whose full name was Ricardo Torres, had a pattern. 2 previous relationships with women in vulnerable situations, one a recent widow, the other a newly laid-off single mother. In both cases, there were no police records, no formal charges, just a trail of anecdotal reports from friends and family about a man who at first seemed like a savior, but who gradually isolated them, controlled their finances, and left them emotionally shattered. He was a ghost, a master of operating in the gray areas where psychological abuse leaves no marks for the law to see. He always left before the situation exploded, usually taking with him whatever assets or savings the woman had. The second front of the attack came from a direction Arthur hadn't anticipated, a call from Child Protective Services. The voice on the other end of the line was bureaucratic and cold. A report had been filed. A man, Arthur Sterling, was keeping a minor, Leah, from her family. The report, anonymous but clearly orchestrated by Ricardo, painted him as a predator, a wealthy man using his power to interfere with a happy, humble family. "Mr. Sterling, we understand your intentions may have been good," the social worker said, "but the procedure is clear. The child must be returned to her home. Her mother, Monica, and her partner, Ricardo, have filed a formal complaint. They claim the mother is distraught over her daughter's absence and that you are refusing to return her." Arthur felt a wave of impotent fury. Ricardo wasn't just defending himself. He was attacking, using the very institutions created to protect Leah as weapons against him. He was inverting the narrative with diabolical skill. "That's absurd," Arthur said, trying to remain calm. "The girl is terrified. The man is a manipulator. You need to investigate the domestic situation." "We will do that, Mr. Sterling. A visit will be scheduled. But until then, the law is on their side. If the child is not returned within 24 hours, we will be forced to involve the police for kidnapping. You're a businessman. You understand laws. Your resources, in this case, do not place you above them. On the contrary, they make the situation look even more suspicious." The threat was real. His fortune, which he had always seen as armor, was now the weakest link in his defense. It was easy for Ricardo to paint him as an eccentric and dangerous billionaire. The tabloids would love such a story. His lawyers advised him to back down, to return Leah, and let the authorities handle it. It was the logical move, the one that minimized the risk to his assets and reputation. But then he looked into the converted conference room, where Leah, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, was laughing at a cartoon on TV. The sound of her laughter, genuine and carefree, was something he hadn't heard since he'd found her. It was the sound of safety, a sound he had provided. To return her now would be like throwing her back to the wolves, knowing exactly what awaited her. Business logic said to cut his losses, but something deeper, a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed, screamed that this was one loss he could not accept. He hung up on the social worker, his mind racing. He had 24 hours to find a loophole, a piece of evidence, anything that could turn the tide, but against an enemy who left no tracks and used the law as a shield. His billions felt like sand slipping through his fingers. The countdown had begun, and for the first time, Arthur Sterling had no contingency plan. He was completely cornered. The 24-hour deadline imposed by Child Protective Services hung over Arthur like a sentence. The pressure was immense. His lawyers bombarded him with calls, pleading with him to act with his head, not his heart. The risk to his business, his reputation, and his freedom was stratospheric. Every fiber of his being, trained by years of pragmatism and risk management, screamed at him to hand Leah over and walk away. It would be the smart decision, the one that would protect his vast fortune and the stability of his empire. But the image of Leah's terrified eyes at the school gate was seared into his mind. He couldn't do it. Night fell on the city, the light spreading out like a carpet of diamonds below his office. Leah, exhausted by the tension she could feel in the air, even without fully understanding it, had fallen asleep on one of the sofas, clutching a teddy bear Helena had bought her. Watching her sleep, her face serene and innocent, solidified Arthur's resolve. He would not give up. Desperate for a new lead, he called Marcus again. "I need more. Marcus. Anything. Neighbors, delivery guys, the mailman. Someone must have seen or heard something. A fight, a scream, anything to puncture this facade of a happy family." While Marcus reactivated his network of informants, Arthur delved back into the details of the report on Ricardo Torres. There was something there he was missing. He read and reread the names of the previous women, the cities they lived in, the jobs Ricardo had held. They were low-level jobs, always involving security or logistics. A doorman, a night watchman, a stockroom assistant, jobs that gave him access, that allowed him to observe without being noticed. It was then that a detail, a footnote in the report, leaped out at him. Ricardo's last job, before he moved in with Monica, had been with a third-party security firm. The company's name, Vigilant Shield Security, sounded vaguely familiar. With a racing heart, Arthur accessed the Sterling Capital intranet. He navigated to the vendor list, the facilities department, and there it was, in black and white. Vigilant Shield Security was the firm responsible for the night security of his building, the building where he was at that very moment. A chill ran down his spine. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. He opened the list of employees assigned to his building, and his name was there, Ricardo Torres. He wasn't just some random abuser who had crossed paths with a vulnerable family. He worked in the same building as Arthur. He knew the layout, the schedules, the camera blind spots. Arthur's world seemed to tilt on its axis. The feeling of being hunted, which had been just a paranoid thought, now solidified into a terrifying certainty. Ricardo hadn't just stumbled upon Leah. Somehow, he knew about Arthur. He had studied his target, the girl at the school gate. Was it a coincidence? Or was it a deliberate lure? His office door opened softly. It was Helena, her expression worried. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry to disturb you this late, but the night shift security guard is here. He says there's a security alert on your floor, and he needs to check the office personally. His name is Ricardo." Arthur's blood ran cold. He glanced at the security monitor on his desk, which showed the camera feed from the hallway. There he was, Ricardo Torres, standing right outside his office. A subtle, smug smile played on his lips. He wasn't here for a security alert. He was here for Arthur. He knew Leah was inside, behind him on the sofa. Leah stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Arthur looked at the door, then at the sleeping girl, and his desperation morphed into an icy rage. The chessboard had been dramatically, unexpectedly upended. The predator was no longer in a distant house across town. He was right outside the door, and Arthur, the powerful billionaire, was locked in his own fortress with the child he'd sworn to protect, completely exposed and vulnerable. The war had come to his doorstep. Arthur's world contracted to the confined space of his office, the solid wood door, and the man on the other side. Ricardo's smile on the monitor was the personification of arrogance, a predator who had cornered his prey and was savoring the moment. Every instinct screamed at Arthur to barricade the door, call the police, and expose everything. But he knew it would be his word against a security guard performing his duty. Ricardo had the perfect excuse: a security alert, standard procedure. Any over-the-top reaction from Arthur would only reinforce the narrative that he was unstable and dangerous. "Helena," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerously calm, each syllable laced with steel authority. "Tell the guard the alert is a false alarm. I tripped it myself by accident and have already resolved it. Thank him and tell him he can return to his post." He watched the monitor, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw Helena relay the message, and Ricardo's expression flicker for a split second, the surprise of being denied access quickly replaced by a mask of professionalism. He nodded and walked away. But Arthur knew this wasn't the end. It was a statement. Ricardo was showing his hand, revealing just how close he could get. The audacity of the move was breathtaking. He was using his job, his position of trust, to intimidate the man trying to protect his victim. Sterling Capital, his fortress, had been infiltrated. As soon as Ricardo's image vanished from the hallway, Arthur acted. "Helena, I want you to leave now, discreetly. Take Leah with you. Use the rear service exit. My driver, George, will be waiting there. Go to my apartment. Don't talk to anyone. Don't answer the phone. Just get out of here and keep her safe." While Helena, her face pale but resolute, gently woke Leah and guided her out through a side door that connected his office to the rest of the floor. Arthur called Marcus again. "He works in my building, Marcus Ricardo Torres, night security. He just tried to get into my office. I need more than his past. I need surveillance. Now, I want to know every step he takes, every person he talks to, every cigarette he smokes. I want eyes on him 24/7. The discovery transformed Arthur's fear into a strategic fury. He finally understood the game's dynamics. Ricardo wasn't just reacting, he was hunting. He had deliberately positioned himself close to Arthur. The choice of Leah's family, living near the school where Arthur was scheduled for that meeting, couldn't have been random. It was all part of a larger plan, the dimensions of which he couldn't yet comprehend. What did Ricardo want? Was it just Monica's money? Or was there more? Was it blackmail? An extortion attempt using the girl as bait? The implications were staggering. His own company, the epicenter of his wealth and power, was compromised. How many other vigilant SHIELD employees could be involved? What else did Ricardo know about him? About his business, his routines, his vulnerabilities? He, who had built his fortune on information and data control, felt completely exposed. In the days that followed, the office became a silent battleground. Arthur barely slept. Fueled by coffee and adrenaline, he scoured every contract, every service clause with vigilant SHIELD. In parallel, Marcus's reports began to arrive, painting an even darker picture. Ricardo was meticulous. He followed a predictable routine, did nothing overtly suspicious, but there was something in his patterns. He spent a disproportionate amount of time near the executive floor and, more disturbingly, Marcus discovered he had befriended some of the cleaning and maintenance staff, people with unrestricted access to nearly every area of the building. Meanwhile, the pressure from CPS mounted. The social worker called daily, her voice growing more impatient. Ricardo's story, that of a concerned stepfather fighting a powerful billionaire who had kidnapped his stepdaughter, was gaining traction. Arthur knew he was losing the war of public and bureaucratic opinion. One night, while reviewing security camera footage he had requested, he noticed something. Ricardo, during his rounds, always paused for a few seconds near the office of one of his top executives, the chief financial officer. It wasn't a long stop, just a pause, almost imperceptible. But he did it every single night. Why that office in particular? Suddenly, a new fear, deeper and more professional, took hold. What if Leah wasn't the only target? What if the vulnerability of that family was just a means to a much larger end? What if Ricardo's true target wasn't Arthur the man, but Sterling Capital the company? The game had just become infinitely more complex and dangerous, and Arthur realized that Leah's safety was now intrinsically linked to the security of his entire empire. The revelation that Ricardo might have a strategic interest in Sterling Capital completely changed Arthur's perspective. The problem, which had begun as intensely personal and emotional, now branched into the core of his professional life. The attack wasn't just on him as an individual, but on the very foundation of his fortune. This new dimension of the conflict, however, put him in more familiar territory. Dealing with corporate threats, industrial espionage, and calculating adversaries was the world where he thrived. The anger and desperation gave way to a cold, analytical clarity. He called an emergency meeting with his head of internal security, a former intelligence agent named Isabel, and his CFO, a meticulous man named Claudio. He didn't reveal Leah's full story, framing the situation as a suspected security breach. Ricardo Torres, one of the night guards from Vigilant Shield. I want a full sweep of everything. Systems, offices, especially yours. Claudio, check for listening devices, spyware, anything out of the ordinary. And Isabel, I want a full profile on every Vigilant Shield employee working in this building. I don't trust them anymore. While his security team began a discreet but comprehensive operation, Arthur felt the weight of living a double life. By day, he was the ruthless CEO managing a security crisis. At night, in his apartment-turned-fortress, he was Leah's protector. The girl, though safe, sensed the tension. She was quieter, her drawings often depicting small figures hiding from large shadows. She missed her mother, asking for her with a frequency that broke Arthur's heart. "Is Ricardo still mad at us, Uncle Arthur?" she asked one night as they ate dinner in the kitchen. The domesticity of the scene, him in his shirt sleeves serving macaroni to a child, was as foreign to Arthur as trading a crypto fund. "He's not mad, Leah. He's just confused, and we're going to fix it, I promise," he lied. Hating the taste of the falsehood in his mouth, the bond between him and Leah deepened with each passing day. He helped her with the homework Helena brought from her school, read her bedtime stories, and discovered she had an infectious laugh when they watched old comedies. He was experiencing fragments of a fatherhood he never wanted, discovering a vulnerability in himself that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. This new emotion, however, made the stakes even higher. Protecting Leah was no longer a matter of principle, it was a visceral need. It was then that other employees began to come forward. Spurred by Isabel's internal investigation, which was being conducted under the guise of a routine security audit, small stories about Ricardo began to emerge. A secretary mentioned he had once made an odd comment about her boss's new car, knowing the exact model and price without anyone having told him. A junior analyst recalled that Ricardo always seemed to know when he was working late, asking casual but probing questions about the project he was on. They were small pieces, insignificant on their own, but together they formed a mosaic of a man who was an obsessive observer, collecting information, mapping the routines and lives of the people around him. No one had connected the dots before, but now, under Isabel's scrutiny, the pattern of subtle intimidation and data collection became clear. The proof that the threat was real and immediate came from Claudio, the CFO. His face was pale when he walked into Arthur's office, closing the door behind him. "We found it," he said, his voice strained. "It wasn't a physical device, it was smarter, a keylogger. Software installed on my computer. It was copying every single keystroke I made, passwords, emails, confidential financial reports. Arthur, he had access to everything, profit projections, investment strategies, future acquisition data. The information he stole, in the wrong hands, it could bankrupt us." The floor seemed to vanish from under Arthur's feet. The situation had escalated from a family drama to a catastrophic-level corporate crisis. Ricardo wasn't just a domestic abuser, he was an industrial spy. And Leah wasn't just a victim, she was the key, the entry point. The perfect bait used to divert Arthur's attention, while the real attack was happening right under his nose. The trap was more ingenious and devastating than he could have ever imagined. The discovery of the spyware on Claudio's computer was like a lightning strike that illuminated the grim landscape, revealing the true nature of the threat. Arthur felt a surge of cold adrenaline. He had been fighting the wrong war. While his focus had been on protecting Leah and exposing Ricardo's domestic abuse, the real battlefield was his company, and Ricardo's weapon was information. The fortune he had spent a lifetime building, the business that was his legacy, was all vulnerable. The theft of financial data of that caliber could be used to manipulate his company's stock price, sabotage deals, or for massive-scale extortion. Ricardo wasn't a lone wolf. A plan this sophisticated required a mastermind, someone with market knowledge. He was just the soldier on the front lines. Arthur's immediate priority was damage control. He and Isabel worked in absolute secrecy, strengthening firewalls, changing passwords and security protocols across the entire company. They decided to leave the keylogger active, but feed it carefully crafted false information. A risky gambit to try and trace where the data was being sent and hopefully identify who was pulling the strings. While the digital battle raged behind the scenes, Arthur's personal war intensified. Ricardo, realizing his infiltration might have been discovered or that Arthur wasn't folding under pressure, launched his counterattack, and it was brutal. It began with a leak to a financial gossip blog. The story was sensationalist and carefully worded, planting seeds of doubt about Arthur Sterling's stability. It spoke of erratic behavior, an inappropriate interest in a child and her family, and suggested the billionaire was using his vast wealth to harass a hard-working family man. The story didn't accuse him of anything directly, but the insinuation was poisonous. It was Ricardo's play. He was using the truth, Arthur's involvement with Leah, and twisting it to create a completely false and destructive narrative. Arthur's phone rang off the hook. Board members, investors, business partners, they all wanted an explanation. His reputation, one of his most valuable assets, was being systematically dismantled. He, who had always controlled the narrative around himself and his company, was losing control spectacularly. But the most devastating blow came next. Ricardo coerced Monica into giving an interview. It was for a local TV station, an afternoon program with a high viewership among stay-at-home parents. Arthur watched, helpless, from his apartment. Monica appeared on screen, her face gaunt, her eyes lifeless. Beside her, Ricardo looked the picture of concern and righteousness, a protective hand on her shoulder. In a trembling voice, clearly reading a script forced upon her, Monica told the story Ricardo had created. She said her daughter, Leah, had a very vivid imagination. She said Mr. Sterling, a powerful and lonely man, had taken a strange liking to the girl and was trying to meddle in their family. She pleaded with tears Arthur knew were of desperation and not sorrow, for him to leave her family in peace and give back her daughter. Every word was a knife in Arthur's heart. He could see the terror in Monica's eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, signs invisible to the public but clear as day to him. Ricardo was using her as a human shield, forcing her to become complicit in her own captivity. The impact was immediate. Public opinion, always inclined to distrust the rich and powerful, turned against him. The narrative was now set, an eccentric billionaire versus a poor, defenseless family. The social worker from CPS called her voice glacial. He had one last chance to return Leah voluntarily, or the police would be coming with a warrant. Everything was collapsing. His reputation was in tatters. His business was under attack. The authorities were against him, and the mother of the child he was trying to save had just publicly denounced him. He was completely isolated, painted as the villain in the story where he was so desperately trying to be the hero. Ricardo wasn't just winning, he was annihilating Arthur on every front. The silence in Arthur's apartment was an anomaly, a deafening vacuum in the center of the hurricane that was his life. Outside, the digital and media worlds were buzzing with his downfall. His name was being dragged through the mud, his reputation, carefully polished over decades, crumbling with every click and share. Monica's interview had been the final nail in the coffin. He was, officially, the villain. The calls from his lawyers, once insistent, were now sparse, their tones bordering on resignation. The message was clear, the game was over. It was time to surrender, return Leah, and try to salvage what was left from the wreckage of his businesses. His every instinct for self-preservation, the same one that had made him a billionaire before he was 40, screamed at him to cut his losses. He sat in the dim light of his living room. The television screen dark, but the image of Monica's terror-filled eyes burned into his retina. He felt hollow, drained of all his strength and certainty. For the first time, he couldn't see a way out. Ricardo had built a fortress of lies so perfect that the truth had become powerless against it. It was then that he felt a tiny touch on his arm. Leah was standing beside him in her star-patterned pajamas, her large, serious eyes fixed on him. She wasn't crying. There was a gravity on her face that didn't belong to a 6-year-old. "You saw Mommy on TV, didn't you, Uncle Arthur?" she whispered. He could only nod, unable to form a reply that wasn't laced with bitterness. "She was lying," Leah said, with an absolute certainty that stunned him. "I know when she's lying, her mouth smiles, but her eyes don't." Her eyes were scared. The same scared they get when Ricardo yells at her and throws things. The girl's simple words cut through Arthur's fog of despair like a lighthouse beam. She saw what the rest of the world couldn't. She knew the truth on a visceral level, immune to media manipulation. In that moment, Arthur realized his fight wasn't for his reputation, his business, or even his sense of justice. It was for her, for the unwavering faith she placed in him. She was his only ally, and he could not fail her. A new resolve, born not of arrogant power but of pure protection, solidified within him. If the world believed he was the monster, so be it. He would fight from the shadows. "You're right, Leah. She was scared," he said, his voice firm for the first time in days. "And that's why we're not giving up on her." He pulled her into a hug, and for the first time, the gesture felt natural, necessary. It was then that Leah, feeling safe enough to dredge up the strangest memories, said something that would change everything. "Uncle Arthur, Ricardo has a secret box, an old shoebox he keeps under his bed. He told me never to touch it, but I saw it open once." She paused, trying to remember. "It had some old papers and a picture. It was him when he was younger, and he was with a man. Arthur's heart began to beat faster. What man, Leah? Do you remember him? He was older. He had a nice smile, like yours, and he wore a big gold watch. Ricardo was looking at him in the picture with a weird look, an angry look. A terrible, illogical, and overwhelming suspicion began to form in Arthur's mind. He stood, walked to his desk, and picked up a silver picture frame. It was an old photo from nearly 20 years ago. A young, newly graduated him, standing next to his long-deceased father. His father, with his charismatic smile and the unmistakable gold watch that was his trademark, the only valuable piece of his inheritance. With trembling hands, he knelt in front of Leah and showed her the photo. Leah, the man in the picture with Ricardo. Was it this man? Leah stared at the photograph, her eyes widening in recognition. She pointed a tiny finger at the image of Arthur's father. That's him, she whispered, her voice full of awe. That's the man from the picture with Ricardo. Arthur's world stopped. The room, the city, the entire universe held its breath. This wasn't a random attack. It wasn't about money or control. It was personal. It was revenge. And the target had never been just him. The target was the Sterling name. This man hadn't entered Leah's life by chance. He had been placed there, a domino in a game of vengeance that had started decades before Arthur even knew he was playing. The revelation landed on Arthur with the weight of a concrete slab. The chessboard he thought he was playing on was suddenly swept away, revealing a much older, more personal battlefield. The image of his father, smiling in the photograph, haunted him. His father, a brilliant but ruthless businessman in his early years, had left a trail of rivals and enemies. How many lives had he upended? How many people harbored a grudge against the Sterling name? Ricardo wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn, moved by an unseen, vengeful hand. The connection to his father was the key to everything. The adrenaline of discovery replaced his despair. He finally had a thread to pull. Ricardo's secret box was the linchpin. It held the proof, the missing link. But it was in the house, a fortress guarded by the enemy himself. And time was running out. The police could be at his door any moment with a warrant to take Leah. He looked at the girl, who watched him with a trust that was both his greatest strength and his greatest responsibility. He could not fail. The plan that formed in his mind was audacious, risky, and likely illegal. It went against everything his lawyers would advise, but it was his only chance. He had to get into that house and retrieve the box. First, he needed a diversion. He used the one weapon Ricardo had given him. The media. He called a trusted journalist, one of the few who hadn't yet condemned him, and offered an exclusive interview. "I'm ready to tell my side of the story," he said, setting the meeting for 2 hours from now at a hotel across town. The news would spread like wildfire, and he knew Ricardo, obsessed with controlling the narrative, wouldn't resist monitoring every second. He would be glued to his television, waiting to see Arthur's next move. Second, he needed access. He called Marcus. "I need you, in person, and I need your best tools. We have a very small window of opportunity." As the city buzzed with the news of his impending interview, Arthur and Marcus met on a quiet street a few blocks from Monica's house. The plan was simple in its audacity. Marcus, a master of unconventional entry, would pick the back lock while Arthur stood watch. The moment of greatest tension came as they approached the small house. The lights were on. Through the living room window, Arthur could see Ricardo's silhouette, his back to the window, eyes fixed on the TV screen, just as he had predicted. Monica was nowhere in sight. The sight of him, so close, so real, made Arthur's blood boil. Marcus worked with a mesmerizing speed and silence. In less than a minute, the back door lock yielded with a nearly inaudible click. Arthur's heart was in his throat. He slipped into the house, the air thick with the smell of fear and reheated food. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a scream. He moved up the stairs like a ghost on his own Black Ops mission. Ricardo's room was Spartan and oppressive. He knelt and looked under the bed. There it was, a worn-out shoebox, tied with string. His hands trembled as he grabbed it. He didn't waste time looking inside. He just tucked it under his coat and retreated, step by step, out of the house. When the back door clicked shut behind them, Arthur felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly made him dizzy. They had it. Back in the car, the adrenaline began to subside, replaced by a feverish anxiety. He opened the box. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, all about his father, most concerning a business scandal from 20 years ago where a small tech firm was driven to bankruptcy after a hostile takeover by Sterling Capital. There were also a series of letters, and the photograph Leah had described. In it, a young, lean and angry Ricardo stood next to an older man, and that man was the owner of the failed company. His name, Arthur vaguely recalled, was Valdemar. He had lost everything, and according to one of the clippings, he had a son who had sworn revenge, but the final, most devastating piece was at the bottom of the box. It was a birth certificate. The mother's name was unknown, but the father's name was there, clear as day, Valdemar Torres, and below it, the son's name, Ricardo Sterling Torres. Sterling. His mother's name, who, according to the story, had a brief affair with Arthur's father before he was married. The truth hit him with the force of a gut punch. Ricardo wasn't just the son of a business rival. He was his half-brother, his father's illegitimate son, abandoned and left to be raised by the man his father had destroyed. This whole ordeal, the torture of Monica and Leah, the espionage, the attack on his company, it was all a twisted revenge, a scream of pain and hatred from a brother he never knew he had, targeting the only legacy their father had left him, the Sterling name. The birth certificate in Arthur's hands felt like it weighed a ton. Each letter etched on the old paper rewriting the history of his life. Ricardo wasn't a stranger, a random monster. He was family, his own blood, a lost brother whose life had been shaped by the ruthless shadow of their shared father. The revenge, Arthur understood with a painful clarity, wasn't just about money or power. It was about identity, about a desperate cry for recognition, even if it came in the form of destruction. For a moment, his anger gave way to a complex, dizzying feeling, something akin to pity. He saw the abandoned boy behind the cruel man, but empathy couldn't erase Ricardo's actions. It couldn't undo the terror inflicted upon Leah and Monica. The revelation, as shocking as it was also his most powerful weapon. It was irrefutable proof of motive, of the personal obsession that unmasked Ricardo's entire facade. With the shoebox as his only ally, Arthur didn't go to the interview he had scheduled. Instead, he went straight to the police department, not to the front desk, but to the office of a financial crimes detective he knew vaguely, a man known for his tenacity and his dislike of arrogant billionaires. Arthur walked into the office not as the powerful CEO, but as a man seeking justice, stripped of his armor of wealth. He placed the box on the detective's desk and told him everything. The story of Leah, the abuse, the corporate espionage, the media manipulation, and finally, the ultimate revelation of his family connection to Ricardo. He presented Marcus's reports, the evidence of the keylogger collected by Isabel, and the contents of the shoebox. For the first time, the complete story made sense. It wasn't a kidnapping or a simple case of domestic abuse. It was a complex scheme of personal revenge and industrial espionage, with a mother and daughter trapped in the middle. While the police, now with a legitimate warrant, moved to arrest Ricardo, Arthur took the next step. He knew that Ricardo's arrest wouldn't free Monica from her psychological chains. He called a renowned psychologist specializing in abuse victims and asked her to meet him at Monica's house, along with the social worker from CPS, whom he contacted next. explaining the turn of events. When Arthur arrived at the small house, the police had already taken Ricardo, who, caught completely off guard, had offered no resistance. Monica was sitting on the sofa, curled into a ball, looking like an empty shell. Fear still paralyzed her. Arthur approached her carefully, not as a savior, but as someone who understood a fraction of her pain. "Monica, it's over," he said softly. "He can't hurt you or Leah anymore. He's been arrested." She looked at him, her eyes filled with disbelief and a deep-seated dread. "He'll come back," she whispered. "He always comes back." It was then that the psychologist, Dr. Lucia, intervened with a calm, reassuring voice. "Monica, my name is Lucia. I'm here to help. What you've been through is terrible, but you're not alone anymore. We're going to take care of you and Leah." The resolution was neither instant nor magical. It was the beginning of a long, painful process. Arthur's first victory was watching the social worker, her face etched with remorse, apologize and ensure that Monica and Leah would receive the full support of the system that had previously failed them. His second victory came later that night when he brought Leah home. The reunion between mother and daughter was an explosion of tears and hugs, a moment of pure catharsis that washed away some of the darkness of the past weeks. Seeing Leah safe in her mother's arms, in a house now free of Ricardo's oppressive presence, was the most meaningful return on investment Arthur had ever received, surpassing any profit or dividend he had ever seen. The final victory, however, was quieter and more internal. As he left the house, leaving Monica in Dr. Lucia's care, he looked up at the night sky. The immediate crisis had passed. Ricardo was in custody, facing a long list of charges from coercion to corporate espionage. Monica and Leah were safe and beginning their journey of healing. His business, though shaken, would recover. But Arthur Sterling, the man, had been irrevocably transformed. He had risked everything: his fortune, his reputation, his freedom, not for a deal, but for a principle. He learned that his vast portfolio, his assets and holdings, weren't a shield to isolate himself from the world, but a tool that, if used correctly, could protect, heal, and deliver justice. The fortress he had built to keep people out had been breached, and in its ruins he found a human connection he never knew he was looking for. 4 weeks after that sun-drenched afternoon, that changed everything. Arthur Sterling's world was an unrecognizable place. The media firestorm had passed, replaced by a narrative of reluctant heroism. The case against Ricardo was airtight, and the story of his personal vendetta, combined with the espionage, became a scandal the press devoured. This time with Ricardo as the definitive villain, Sterling Capital, after a period of turbulence, had stabilized. The attempted attack, once exposed, had ironically strengthened investor confidence in Arthur's security and leadership. The bottom line, in the end, was preserved. But these were external victories, echoes of a life he no longer recognized as his own. The real transformation was happening in the quiet spaces, far from boardrooms and stock tickers. He was at a playground, the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves of the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the sand. Sitting on a wooden bench, he watched Leah. She was no longer the trembling, frightened girl from the school gate. She ran, climbed the slide, and her laughter echoed through the park, a sound of pure, infectious joy. She was in a new school, in a new neighborhood. Monica, with the financial and therapeutic support Arthur had provided, was slowly rebuilding herself. She had landed a new job, and for the first time in a long time, there was hope in her eyes. Arthur was no longer just Uncle Arthur. He had become a constant, steady presence in their lives, a guardian, a friend. He visited them on weekends, not out of obligation, but because their absence left a void in his perfectly scheduled life. He learned how to build sandcastles, how to push a swing to just the right height. and how to appreciate the taste of strawberry ice cream melting in the sun. They were small investments of time and affection, but the emotional returns were infinite. He thought of Ricardo, now a distant figure behind bars, awaiting trial. There was no triumph in his heart, only a profound sadness for a life wasted on hatred. He had discovered that his father had had an affair but had never known about the son. Ricardo had been a victim of circumstance, shaped by abandonment and the bitterness of the man who raised him. Arthur, in a final act of closure, set up an anonymous fund to ensure Ricardo had competent legal defense, not out of forgiveness, but out of a sense of justice that now extended beyond himself. His biggest change, however, occurred within the walls of his own company. He established the Sterling Foundation for Family Protection. The program, funded by a significant portion of his annual dividends, offered legal, psychological, and financial support for employees and their families facing situations of vulnerability. He gave talks, using his own story as a powerful testament, encouraging his peers, many of them multimillionaires and billionaires, to look beyond the cash flow and invest in the human capital of their communities. The man who once saw philanthropy as a mere PR tool now saw it as his most important responsibility. Leah ran up to him, her face flushed with happiness, and handed him a dandelion. "Make a wish, Uncle Arthur," she said, with the seriousness of a child performing a sacred ritual. Arthur looked at the small weed in his hand. What could he possibly wish for? He had all the wealth, all the assets a man could desire. The gold, the dollars, the euros in his accounts meant nothing compared to what he had gained. He had gained a purpose. He had gained a connection. He had gained a family, not of blood, but of the heart. He closed his eyes, not to make a wish, but to give thanks. He blew on the dandelion, watching the seeds dance and scatter on the wind, each a small promise of hope carried out into the world. He had learned that true strength wasn't in building walls to protect yourself from the messiness of life, but in having the courage to tear them down to protect others. The man who controlled everything had finally understood that life's greatest asset was that which you could not control. Love, compassion, and the courage to get involved. And in that knowledge, he found a peace that no fortune could ever buy.